When I was ordained and Carrie and I found my first job and we moved, she moved from Chicago and I moved from LA. We moved to Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And like Akron, they have a minor league baseball team. And like Akron, they have an unusual name for their minor league baseball team. In Winston-Salem, the name of the baseball team is the Dash. The reason is because the dash between Winston and Salem defines not only something unique about the city, but also its history. So here's a little history. I think it's interesting. You can tell me it's not later. The history of Winston-Salem. In 1766, the town of Salem was established by Moravians, a small Christian community. They called it Salem because it comes from the Hebrew word shalom. So relying on their biblical roots, they defined their little village in 1766. Almost 100 years later, in 1849, they sold a bunch of the property to the north. It was named, not to the north, like to the north of Salem, not to the north of the country. So they sell this property that's north of their property, the northern section. And the people who lived there named it after a Revolutionary War hero, Joseph Winston, therefore born the town of Winston. A few years later, 1870, two tobacco farmers, one named Reynolds, the others named Haynes, were shipping so much material to the area of Winston and Salem that it was declared the 8th largest port in the United States, even though it was 200 miles from the nearest sea. Eventually, Reynolds bought out Haynes. Haynes started making different products. Hopefully you're using Haynes products more than you're using Reynolds products today. And in 1899, the United States Postal Service added a dash, the hyphen, making Winston-Salem the largest city in North Carolina at the time. The dash did not eliminate either Winston or Salem. It connected the two. They remain that way today. You can still go to a part of the town called Old Salem, and when you say you live in Winston-Salem, you say you live in Winston-Salem. And the name of the team is the Dash. So what's the purpose of the dash? What's grammatically called a hyphen? According to Grammarly.com, something I imagine very few of you have used, but my kids use it every day when they write anything they write for school, this website that offers them grammar advice. When you hyphenate a word, you make a new word that doesn't eliminate either of the two previous words, but rather adds to them, emphasizes them, and often the hyphen isn't even needed. So examples that it gives are the phrase brand new. You put the hyphen in the middle, and something becomes brand new, not just a brand and new, but something together. Or prize winning. You could use the word separately, but you put the hyphen there and it elevates the meaning as if it's almost one word with those two meanings. Or as we might say, I'm going to watch the Browns-Bengals game. You put the hyphen. Didn't say whether you'll be happy after the game or not, but we might watch the Browns-Bengals game, and that would be hyphenated. There'd be a dash put in the middle to connect the two to say it's a single game. It's not the Browns playing or the Bengals playing, but rather both teams fully there together. It hasn't always been seen this way, and perhaps we'd say today this is the truth as well. A century ago, Theodore Roosevelt ran his campaign on the motto of America for Americans. It was followed by the 1916 campaign of Woodrow Wilson, who publicly denounced what he called hyphenated Americans, referring to German Americans, Jewish Americans, Irish Americans, and Italian Americans. In other words, there is Americans, and then there's the hyphenated Americans. In this case, hyphenated meant you were split. You had different allegiances, that actually it was subtractive. Somehow being hyphenated, being a Jewish American or an Italian American, made you less American than just those Americans. But that's not what a dash is supposed to do. It's not supposed to be subtractive if you use it correctly. It's supposed to be additive. It's supposed to connect two full things to each other. Winston and Salem didn't become half the cities they were in order to become one city. They, in fact, became a larger city that embodied both. I mention this because what we heard 100 years ago in presidential campaigns, we hear the same trope again in words that Kanye West uses and words that people put signs over the highway in LA this week, and what's happening on college campuses. The sense that somehow the Jewish people are a singular people separate from everything else, no hyphen, not Jewish Americans, not Jewish philanthropists, but rather just those Jews over there doing those things all together, separate from us and against us, and they subtract from us, therefore we must do something about it. Which brings us to another hyphenated word, which is arguably hyphenated, still debated, anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is intended, again, not to be subtractive, but rather to say that you're against something. Two things. I'm against something that is whole. Semitism, Semites. Many have argued that it shouldn't be hyphenated at all, in fact, and many have argued it should be called anti-Judaism. Because much of what anti-Semites try to do is to define what hyphenates our life as something that either takes away, or eventually what happens, as we heard this week, they drop the hyphen altogether, and they say that there's nothing else valuable, nothing else worth mentioning in these people's lives other than that they are Jewish. This is what Kanye West did last week in his comments as he declared war on the Jewish people. There's an article this week by Yair Rosenberg in The Atlantic, and he sums up exactly what I worry about in these comments that are made. It's not what Kanye West, it's not the fact that a famous person in our country says hateful things about the Jewish people. There are always going to be people who are anti-Semitic, just like there will always be people who are hateful in any number of ways, and they're always going to spurt off at the mouth and say something stupid. The problem is that that becomes the only thing that the typical average person hears about Judaism. So Yair Rosenberg put it this way this week. American society lost out this week. Once more, it learned about Jews and Judaism not from Jews themselves, but through the warped worldview of their despisers. It is good that many have been reminded yet again that Jews do not constitute a clandestine cabal bent on world domination. But for anti-Semitism to be meaningfully ameliorated, society will need to learn what Jews are, not just what they are not. People will need to encounter actual Jews in all their diversity, to experience films and popular culture about how Jews live, not just how they died. Only exposure to the richness of Jewish reality can inoculate someone against the caricatures of anti-Jewish calumny. And he writes, Jews are a proud and diverse people who have thrived for millennia, and whose collective experience is far richer than simply surviving oppression. I'll share that sentence again because I think it's one we need to hear. Jews are a proud and diverse people who have thrived for millennia, and whose collective experience is far richer than simply surviving oppression. When we view Jewish existence through the lens of anti-Jewish prejudice, he says, we lose the very elements of it that have enabled the tradition to repeatedly overcome efforts to stifle it. So the problem is when an anti-Semitic action becomes the headlines, we once again have to talk in this trope about why it's not true. We have to explain what's anti-Semitic about it. And for many people, that's the only thing they're going to learn about Judaism this year or maybe even in their life. It overwhelms, overshadows all of the other ways in which our Jewish life is hyphenated. So here's what I hope we can do in response to what happened this week, but also just in general. make sure we connect our Judaism to what we do in our life. You might be a synagogue Jew or a JCC Jew or a Jewish philanthropist or a social action Jew or a spiritual Jew, a Jewish cook, a Sephardic Jew, an Ashkenazic Jew, an African American Jew, 2 hyphens in that one. Or we might just say, I'm a Jewish American. But we aren't just Jewish. That's not the entirety of our identity. We're far more and far more diverse. To imply that we are a unified, single-faceted people is simply to put anti-Semitic language and titles on us. It's to make our fight about anti-Semitism when that's the work the world should be doing. And so what we have to do is that work and the work of showing the world who we are, in addition to fighting all the battles that we have to fight. Second, we have to respond to people who spout anti-Semitism and give them the attention that their words deserve, but not more than they deserve. We have to respond, but in truth, and we saw this week, we need our friends to respond, our non-Jewish friends especially. We shouldn't obsess over what Kanye said. Perhaps others should, but we should trust the dashes that we have in our life, the relationships we have with other people. The response this past week to what he said has been robust. And it's robust because it's so obvious to all the people who are Jewish adjacent, as we might call them, that what he said is not accurate and it's offensive not only to their friends who are Jewish, but to them. So the dashes exist. And we have to continue to add them, the third action. Muslim-Jewish dialogue, Black-Jewish dialogue, interfaith justice series. Last night at First Congregational Church of Akron, there was a wonderful speaker on the history of anti-Semitism in Christian scriptures. And it was a wonderful gathering of our interfaith friends, and many of you from our congregation were there. But to talk about anti-Semitism as it began in the Christian scriptures some 2,000 years ago. Great learning. That's where the dash exists. That's where the conversation should be, not just in us and our kids studying the Holocaust and talking about anti-Semitism. I hope it's one of their topics, but not their only topic. There's a beautiful poem called The Dash by Linda Ellis. Some of you may know it. The first half of it reads as follows. I read of a man who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on the tombstone from the beginning to the end. He noted that first came the date of birth and spoke of the following date with tears. He said what mattered most of all was the dash between those years. For that dash represents all the time they spent alive on earth, and now only those who loved them know what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love and how we spend our dash. What is true for the dash between the years of our birth and death is also true for Judaism. It represents how connected we are, not only to each other, but to the world around us in thousands of ways. And so anti-Semitism is not going away, but it is just one hyphenated word in a sea of hyphenated words related to our people. We shouldn't ignore it, but let's make sure it doesn't define us either. Remember all the other dashes that represent us, that connect us, that protect us, that are a source of pride for our faith and our people. Shabbat shalom. We'll stand now as we turn to our Torah service, sharing the words of Noah. I'll tell you very quickly, we had a bat mitzvah last weekend. Misha Leff read the beginning story of creation of Genesis. And one of our bar mitzvahs from last year came up to me afterwards. He said, how come she got to read this really great story about creation and I had to read about this thing called the tabernacle that nobody knows what it is? And the answer is because your bar mitzvah was in the spring and hers is in the fall. In the fall, we get our best stories. And so today, the story that's perhaps the most known story, the story of Noah. We're reading a section right after the ark has made its journey, and God says to Noah, I'll never do this again. And The world will get to start over, and you will take care of the animals, and we'll have a new